Before starting this special session, Professor Bernard-Henri Lévy said that we should fight, so we are fighting. And he mentioned even in difficult fronts in the ICJ and ICC. So we are everywhere. We don't have formal status. We have formal status in the Human Council in Geneva. We are always there. And we have also achievement there, especially regarding the hostages. But we are in all fronts. So just a few days ago, we published the last issue of Justice, our legal magazine. And it is dedicated to our filing in the International Court of Justice that deal with the legality of occupation and submission, and also, I think, a very special document that I urge each of you to read, and about the legal rights of Israel on West Bank and Gaza. This is not based on historical or biblical rights, but just legal analysis. I want to thank my deputy Daniel Reisner that could not come, and Roy Scheindorf, but please read it. We made few submissions to the ICC. The last one was about the genocide case, but for years we are dealing with the ICC. The Israeli government, Israel is not part of the court, therefore we are not agents of the State of Israel, but we are a voice of the State of Israel. And just to mention one thing, it's not on the defense, but on the attack. We submitted complaints against the Palestinian Authority and President Abbas on their role of supporting terrorism. As you know, there is a ministry, and a lot of the budget is going to pay to terrorists that are in jail, and to their families. So we are active in this fora, and of course in domestic courts combating anti-Semitism, and I fully agree. So we have 2 days in our conference, and the IGL as you see, we are fighting against anti-Semitism and also fighting for the State of Israel. We, as organization, don't deal with internal Israeli issues and with internal Jewish issues. There are many reasons for that, but I think that each organization should concentrate on what it should do, and not going to other directions. So this round table, it's not round, but it's different because it is dealing with internal Israeli issues, the effect on the diaspora, and the issues between Israel and the Jewish diaspora, the diaspora and Israel. This is usually not the terms what we are doing, but I thought that today, when there is such storm in the State of Israel and in the Jewish world, that we should have a special session about it. And so that's, I call it a round table, but this is dealing not with the main theme of this conference. The first topic that I would like to discuss, and each of these distinguished panelists will have the special angle, is relating to what is called the legal reform in Israel. As you know, the Israeli government a year before the war started legislative efforts to change the legal institutions in Israel. The idea was to weaken the Supreme Court, to change the system of appointing judges, to limiting the Supreme Court in intervening with government decisions, dealing with the status of the Attorney General and the legal advisors in the ministries, etc., etc. So what I would like to hear is perhaps Professor Rubinstein will start about, not description, I think people know about, but about your views of what's going on, and later on we'll develop it to the Jewish world.
Thank you very much, Meir. First of all, rabbis in the old days used to start their sermon by saying, before I speak, I'll say a few words. So I'd like to thank Meir Linzen and Malat Tabori and Sharon Banayan, the organizers and all the other members of the IGL team for convening here, the conference here. And there is a significance to being in Poland. Many years ago, Ezer Weizmann, who was our president, told me that in 1946, his uncle Chaim Weizmann, our first president, took him to the first Zionist Congress convening after the Holocaust, and he introduced him to the delegations. He said, this is a delegation from Sweden, this is from Argentina, this is from Chile, this is from all Polish. So, and I'm sure that if we go into the roots of our friends here, we'll find, and this museum reflects 1,000 years of history here, not that much on the Holocaust, but the tragic end is known, and my own family, Polish roots, my wife's family from Warsaw, sent to Treblinka, so there is a significance. Before I speak on the judicial revolution or whatever you call it, I'd like to put it in a perspective. The perspective is Israel. Sometimes because we are so, personally I'm quite depressed by what's going on. When I'm asked how I feel, I say, באופן אישי, personally, ברוך השם, באופן לאומי, nationally, רחם השם. So, just to put it in perspective, first of all, we are in November. Today, November 19, it dawned on me this morning, is the 48th anniversary of the visit of President Sadat. November 19, 1977. I was privileged to be in the airport welcoming him. I was then the assistant to the late Foreign Minister Moshe Dayan, and seeing the airplane landing was like the wings of history, because this is something which just 10 days earlier you couldn't even think of, a visit by the Egyptian president to Israel. And personally, I was later privileged to participate in the negotiations on the Camp David Accord Treaty of Peace, and then negotiation with other Arab neighbors, and including being the chair of the Treaty of Peace negotiation with Jordan. So I'm mentioning that because we did something since the Arab boycott on all of us in 1948 and on, and now we have the Abraham Accords. And November also reminds us, November 2nd is the Balfour Declaration 1917, which was the international, first British, then international recognition of the Jewish homeland in our country. And then November 29 was the UN resolution in 47, and I don't want to go into that. Unfortunately, we had also the Rabin assassination in November, so you have, it's a month full of history. The achievements of Israel, and I'm the oldest person on this panel, I can remember from the 50s how Israel looked like from any point of view. We made a fantastic progress in the gathering of the exiles, the Jews from everywhere, from east and west that came, and our people here were involved in Aliyah efforts, and the Hebrew language, and the academy, and even the Torah world, and a Jewish and democratic state with all its shortcomings, and it has shortcomings, despite existential threats all the time, and which we've been witnessing, including the last terrible 2 years. And we still have, with all the criticism that many of us have on our government, we have freedom of speech and freedom of expression, hopefully freedom of elections, and the courts are still independent and strong, and the efforts to weaken the court have not been really effective. So, and human rights, and the court being the human rights guardian. We are now in the synagogue. We're reading the book of Genesis, of Bereshit, and one of our commentaries, known as Ha'amek Davar by the Volozhin Rabbi Berlin of the 19th century, speaks of the forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, as they are named by our sages as honest. Honest, why? He says because they were honest also to the neighborhood, to people who were pagans and with ugly ways of life and so on, and they still treated them fairly. That's the way, which is amazing for a rabbi in the 19th century to put his finger on this particular point. Now coming to the question, one more word, peace should be pursued even if we know it doesn't happen tomorrow. It takes time. I remember when my co-negotiator, Jordan, was later the prime minister, Majali, late Dr. Majali, and it was slow, and he said that in every culture there's the city of fools. In the Jewish Polish tradition, it's Chelem. In Jordan, it's Tefillah and Salt. So two guys from Salt are in the movie theater, and one says to the other, "You see this midget in the movie?" He says, "Yes." He says, "See the giant?" Says, "In a minute, the midget will kill the giant." He says, "Impossible." He says, "Let's bet." They bet on 5 dinar. A minute later, of course, the midget does kill the giant. He says, "Okay, here are the 5 dinar." He says, "You shouldn't take it because, it wouldn't be fair if I take it. I already saw the movie 3 times, and I knew it was going to happen. So the other guy says, you can take it. He says, why? He says, because I saw it 5 times, but I thought maybe this time would be different. So let's give it a chance. Anyhow, the last 3 years have been bad from the point of view of the, Meir already mentioned the hard feelings that many of us have. The reason that we look at it so suspiciously is that the feeling is, I mean, I can speak for myself, that it's not to improve that they came. To improve, there's always shortcoming, there's always something to improve, and coming from the legal establishment for so many years, I do know that there are, but instead it is to demolish, it is to destroy. And that was the feeling. And for me, going throughout 2023, every week to demonstrate against our own government after 50 years in the Israeli public service was really traumatic. But I felt I couldn't do otherwise because of what I felt was the notion of demolishing the court, demolishing the Attorney General's office, and so on. I taught in Warsaw a short course, a couple of years on Israeli law, and I was very proud to speak of the independence. I'm still proud, but there are all these, now the new thing, or the not new, to change the role of the Attorney General, to split it to 3. This is something which, I mean, it could be the Attorney General's role, which is now a kind of very wide and universal, could be built from the beginning in a different way. But it has been working for 77 years. Now, if you want to demolish it, that's one thing. If you want to improve something, create a committee, give it time, and so on. And so and there are shortcomings. For instance, one of them is that we don't have a full-fledged constitution, and we don't have a constitutional basis for legislation in a full-fledged way. I'm now Professor Yedidia Stern was supposed to be here. Unfortunately, he's had a medical problem, so he stayed home. I will work with him on something known as the slim constitution. The idea being that maybe, probably, I don't think it will happen in this government, but in the future, in the near future, to see whether we can create a skeleton or a basis of the constitutional system that would be more solid, more viable than what we have now. So this is one of the things that could be done. So I've been speaking too long now. All I want to say is this. Most of you know that there is a huge difference between coming with ideas to improve something and between ideas which are clearly to free the hands of the government to do whatever they want and lower and destroy the system of checks and balances that we've been building for many years. And I hope that it will not succeed, but it has already succeeded partially, and we can come back to it. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Rubinstein. Now, Professor Ariel Porat. Professor Ariel Porat felt that he should be on the front line on this topic, and I would like, you're also Professor of Law, but you think that the academia has a special role in dealing with this situation. If you can elaborate.
Yeah, thank you. Well, generally, academia has a role in almost everything, right? You know, academic freedom and free speech, and we expect professors to speak out, especially when there are challenges, social challenges, and this is something that we do all the time. But I think there is a special issue, and probably that's what you meant by your question, is to what extent academic leaders or presidents of universities or provosts should speak out when there is a controversy as to specific issue, and there is no issue which I think in the history of the state of Israel that torn Israeli society apart as the legal reform that we are still undergoing. And the question that I ask myself, actually 3 years ago, when the legal reform has been launched by the Minister of Justice together with the entire Israeli government. So the question I ask myself is, to what extent I should speak out loudly, even though the issue is controversial, as I said, really has torn Israeli society apart. And I had a theory that I created, well, not really created, but established, well, something that I needed for myself to guide myself as to what to do and what not to do. And here is the theory in brief. So first of all, I respect the principle of neutrality. You know, in the United States, it's called the Chicago Principles, which says that university leaders should keep silent with respect to issues which are publicly controversial. So I respect this, starting point. And there are reasons for that starting point. You don't want to be the president of the university to take a side and to create the impression that you are not the president of the entire university. You don't want to have a chilling effect on professors who think differently from you. So there are many good reasons why the principle of neutrality is a good starting point. But as to any other principle, there are also exceptions. And here are the 3 exceptions, and say briefly, that I believe are very important, not just for academic leaders, but also for public figures more generally. And I followed those exceptions during the last 2, actually 3 years. The first one, which is obvious, when there is a threat to academia. Right, if there is a threat to your own university, but also to the entire academia in Israel, and sometimes even more than in Israel, like the global academia, this is your role to speak out. So for example, there were actually 2 occasions in which the Ministry of Education refused to grant the Israeli prize, which is the most prestigious prize in Israel, refused to award the prize, it happened twice, to professors that have expressed political views that the government didn't like. Of course, other people would present it maybe a little bit differently, but I think at the end of the day, it's about that. They have been like extremists in their views. They expressed views very critical of Israel that I personally disagree with, but that's exactly the idea of free speech and freedom of expression. Right? We need freedom of expression and free speech, especially for those situations in which people say things that we don't like. You cannot say that it's just if it's acceptable, and for that you don't need freedom of expression. So actually there are these 2 points, and I was among the people in Israel that led the struggle against the government to make sure that those people would receive the Israel prize. We succeeded in one case and we failed in another case. So this is just an example, and there are many other situations. The second, actually this specific exception, I think it's acceptable, at least as far as I know, by all university leaders in Israel. The second exception is when it's about legal rights or human rights, when there is severe infringements of human rights or civil rights, regardless of whether it touches upon academia or not. This is something, in my view, that public figures, including academia leaders, should speak out. And in the previous session, I talked briefly about the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. I do think, regardless of what people think about that, you know, people could have different views, but if you believe that your country is doing something which is that you criticize with respect to human rights, even if it's in Gaza, definitely if it's in Israel, you should speak out. You should try to influence your own government. It's true that everybody, there would be always those people that would say you are critical on the government, it might adversely affect the Israeli interest outside, but you know that's always the case when you are criticizing your government, right? It might weaken the government, and weakening the government has always two sides, right? Like weakening the government, this is criticism, that's what we should do in democracy. At the same time, sometimes it has a kind of a damaging effect from, especially outside, but this is a price worth paying, at least in my view. The third exception, which is the hardest one to accept, I believe, but that's my view. I'm aware that most university presidents probably do not share this view, or maybe, you know, partly share this view, but not completely. My view is that when a university leader, as well as other public figures, strongly believe, not just a kind of a capricious belief, right? A belief which is based on facts after consulting experts, etc., but if at the end, university leaders believe that our country is under risk, they should speak out. And speaking about the legal reform, just to illustrate, few months after the government launched the legal reform, about 3 years ago, all university presidents, including Ariel University, and definitely including Bar-Ilan University. The reason I mentioned those two universities, because Ariel University is considered to be more rightist in a way, and Bar-Ilan University, you know, I have my own views, but there is some image that also with Bar-Ilan University, they are more to the right than to the left, even though I'm not sure that this is right. Anyway, all university presidents signed a letter addressed to the government, arguing the government to stop the legal reform. That was a consensus. That was a consensus among the university presidents. Later on, I believe out of fear from the government, some of my colleagues changed, not really changed their minds, but have become more passive in a way, and even though their views didn't change, they felt a little bit more hesitant to express views against the government, not me. So I'm very vocal in my criticism of steps that have been taken by our government. And there are numerous examples. If later on you would like me to do, I would be very happy to elaborate. But this is the general theory that I'm working with. And I understand that some people wouldn't accept it, would say that I go too far. I'm trying to focus always not on the government or criticizing the government as per se, but per activities that are done by the government, especially when it's about the rule of law, when it's about academic freedom, when it's about infringing upon human rights and so on. So these are the issues I'm dealing with, and I think that this is my role. I do feel that it's not only something I'm allowed to do, I think sometimes it's really my obligation, my moral and social obligation.
Thank you. Lord Wolfson, I want to hear your view as Lord Wolfson is the Shadow Attorney General of the UK, but as a Jew from the diaspora, but also as let's say, legal leader from Mother of Democracies.
Well, thank you very much. You might be wondering why I have any locus to speak about this issue at all, because I'm not Israeli. Not only that, but I come from a legal system where until 2005, we had in the person of the Lord Chancellor someone who was both head of the judiciary, a member of the cabinet, and also Speaker of the House of Lords. So if you were to create a position which would breach the American approach to separation of powers, it would be the person of the Lord Chancellor. So there might be very good reasons why I really shouldn't be heard on this topic at all. But since you've asked me, I will say something about it. I think there may be perhaps two issues. The first is within Israel, if I can say this as somebody who has deep connections with Israel in many ways. One of the features, of course, of the Israeli political system is that the gap between parliament, between the governing coalition, and between the executive is really shrunk. If you have a majority, say, of 65 in the Knesset, it's not like in the British Parliament, where you still have to control your own backbenchers. And importantly, in the British Parliament, each member of Parliament in the House of Commons has his or her own personal mandate because they've been personally elected. Of course, in Israel, with the list system, if you're second or third on the list for one of the big parties, you'll be elected no matter whether you have fine qualities or you don't. If you add to that the absence of a second chamber, it seems to me that one only really has the Supreme Court as a check and balance in the Israeli political system. And so I approach the judicial reforms as not only being a matter of justice, but really perhaps more being a matter of constitutional balance, seen from the outside. There are many ways you could look at reforming that. That's not for somebody from the outside to suggest. But the second reason why I think this topic is important is because what I can tell you is that from outside Israel, the Israeli Supreme Court is one of Israel's centers of what you might call soft power. When I talk to lawyers in the UK or America or indeed anywhere, they have immense respect for the justices and the judgments of the Israeli Supreme Court. It first was apparent to me when I was judging an essay competition in the UK with Lord Falconer, who was then Lord Chancellor. And we were talking about the Israeli Supreme Court. And I said, look, why don't you read one of their judgments? And I gave him the famous Barak judgment about fighting terrorism with one hand tied behind your back. Now, you may agree with that judgment, you may disagree with that judgment, but as a piece of jurisprudence, it is impressive. And I think Israel sometimes forgets that the Supreme Court is not only important within Israel, but it's important outside Israel as well as a symbol of soft power. If I can just make two short final points. First of all, I did a debate on this topic with somebody from Israel who's intimately involved in the judicial reform, Simcha Rotman, who's head of the Knesset Justice Committee. And he was making the point to me, he said, there's nothing wrong about these reforms because this element of the reform, they have that in the United States. This element is in France. This approach is from the UK. This part is from Denmark. And I said to him, I quite like fish and chips for dinner. It's a lovely dinner. If it's a really cold day, a glass of red wine and spaghetti bolognese is fantastic. In the summer when it's hot, I quite like sushi, fish and rice. If I came round to your house for dinner and you were to give me the chips, the spaghetti, and the rice, that would not be a good dinner. And judicial systems are the same. It is not a smorgasbord. It is not a buffet. It's not a pick and mix. They have to work as a combined whole. Very finally, if I can just pick on one point that Ariel made, I would defend absolutely the right of any academic to speak out on any topic. Whether academics want to self-censor is ultimately a matter for them. What I would suggest, though, is to say that you'll speak out when human rights are an issue, I think really just begs a question as to what you define human rights as being. Because where human rights ends and politics begins is a very subjective decision. Is immigration a matter of politics or human rights? Is the way you conduct war a matter of politics or human rights? And I would suggest that actually academics should have the courage of their convictions to be free to speak out in a personal capacity on any topic. I think to say, well, I'll speak out only when it's a matter of human rights, when there's no definition of where human rights begin and end, really is to provide yourself with a justification which is essentially within your own ability to monitor. But let me hand back to the moderator, because I know we want to hear from Pnina.
Thank you. Pnina, we are in a war, even ceasefire, and there are a special role for lawyers in a war. Pnina herself was head of the public international law branch in the army during a war, a previous war, and if you can elaborate about this aspect of the rule of law.
Yes, thank you very much. And to be on such a respectable panel, thank you especially for that. I think, well, of course, as most of you know, at the moment there's a big drama about the Military Advocate General personally and the unit more generally. And I think when we go back, we have to understand there are two tensions that have always been there. The one which refers to what Lord Wolfson just mentioned, the whole idea of fighting with one hand tied behind the back, and those that are supposed to be there to make sure that indeed you are fighting under the rules are the military lawyers, or the what we call the operational legal advisors, and I was the commander of the operational legal advisors, is really to be there to see that the military is fighting according to the laws. And this was always met with a certain kind of resentment, some pushback. But in the beginning, people didn't understand in the military why there are legal advisors there. And then they came to an understanding that legal advisors are important, and even seeing legal advisors as helping them carry out their mission in a better way. And this was during my time there. I saw this transition. Unfortunately, I think now we see a shift towards a much more suspicion, and this is before the drama, I'm even talking, and even before the war, a pushback against legal advisors in general and against legal advisors in the military. And we've heard, for example, Patsar Sinwar coming in the past, or the whole idea that legal advisors are hindering the victory. And now when we are talking about, in Israel, about the idea of having a committee of inquiry, so the members of the coalition are talking about investigating the role of the legal advisors in 7th of October, in blaming them also even on that. So there's a pushback against the whole idea of having legal advisors. And then there's another point which has always also been sensitive, is having investigations against soldiers during armed conflict situations. And this is actually not unique to Israel. You see it all around the world, a pushback against investigating those that are risking their lives, getting killed, getting injured, and then we are also investigating them like criminals. There's always been really a very strong sentiment against it. But again, in the past, at least, and usually, really, there were very few investigations, again, worldwide, by the way, of actual combat incidents, of criminal investigations. There's fact-finding, and sometimes, in some cases, disciplinary measures, or what we call command measures, like pushing someone aside. But criminal investigation is very rare. But when it came to things that were not on the front line, For example, there was the famous Elor Azaria case in 2016 where a soldier killed a terrorist that was already neutralized, as they say, was injured. He wasn't posing a threat, and the soldier nevertheless killed him. There was, at that time, a criminal investigation and even a criminal prosecution, and this was supported by the then Minister of Defense, the then General Chief of Staff, it was Bogi Ya'alon and Gadi Eisenkot. But again, a lot of the public resented that, but you saw that from the political and the military, at least the senior officers, this was something that was seen as the right way. When it came to, for example, treating detainees and kind of claims against torturing detainees or cases of where detainees were killed, were dead, died during detention, there was an acceptance that these things should be criminally investigated. What we saw in October, since the beginning of the war, is that this has also gone back. First of all, we already started the war with a huge campaign against legal advisors in general, and then the war itself, the trauma of October 7th, the feelings of fear, of threat, of rage, made it even more difficult even to accept legal advisors, but even more to accept any kind of investigation, which led that even when the investigation was opened on a case that is a clear case where you need to investigate claims of torturing a detainee, there was such a campaign against the Military Advocate General and against the Military Advocate General unit, which really included threats and very vocal and violent protests. And we saw this pressure, which led, unfortunately, to things that shouldn't have been done by the Military Advocate General. But now this is used, again, as a way to now undermine first of all, any potential investigation, even the field investigations, the fact-finding investigations, they are not leading to any kind of additional kind of steps, even of just learning, lessons learned to be implemented, and weakening of any kind of advice, legal advice, and legal advisors in the military. And this is, and I'll end by that, this is dangerous for Israel because one of the things, first of all, internally, that make the difference between us and our enemies, I think, is the fact that we view ourselves as having values, as having respect to the rule of law. And if we lose that, and we lose those that are putting some kind of constraints, that would be very bad for us internally. And also, when we talk about the legitimacy, about what's happening on the world, of course, it makes it much more difficult to raise, for example, arguments of a complementarity, which will be discussed tomorrow in the International Criminal Court or in criminal cases around the world, that we are investigating ourselves, so we don't need to interfere. You can't say that if you're not investigating yourself. And also in more general way of showing Israel that we are, showing the world that we are taking the law seriously, that we are respecting the law, that we are investigating ourselves, which makes also, when we don't have also the answers of what happened in the different cases, much more difficult also for our supporters to support Israel, to believe, first of all, that we are really doing our best, and also to be able to explain it to others. So I think we are in a challenging time, and if I link it to the previous panel, I think this idea of blaming the lawyers, of blaming anybody who makes any kind of criticism or is trying to examine what happens as being part of the enemy, as supporting the enemy, is something that is linked to the fact that we feel that the Israeli society feels that everybody is against us in the world. So at least internally, we have to defend everything that we do. So it makes it very difficult because we don't have to defend everything that is done, but we also don't want to give any kind of ammunition to those that are actually want to delegitimize Israel.
Thank you. I want to, we have short of time, so I want to totally different subject. We have famous song in Israel, I think you quoted, "Ha'olam kulo negdenu," all the world is against us. So, when all the world is against us, we want to limit the number of people that are against us. And we see, and Professor Bernard Levy said that the compass moved, that the left is now against Israel and unfortunately also against the Jews. On the other hand, we see the right, they don't love the Jews, they don't love Israel, perhaps, but, and many of the right-wing parties, the roots are really very anti-Semitic, but their main agenda today is not the Jews. They are a small minority in Europe. They are about immigration, about the Muslim role in Europe, etc. And sometimes they distinct, they don't like the Jews, but they like Israel. And the question, and there are elements in the Israeli government, especially one minister, that want to strengthen the relationship between Israel and the right-wing parties. I want to hear two views about it, but primarily from Lord Wolfson, how he sees this.
Well, I mean, the premise of this discussion, the premise is that everybody is against us. I'm not so sure the premise is necessarily right. I think there are lots of people who are anti-Israel, and the increase in anti-Semitism is obvious. I've spoken about both of those many times. I'm far from naive. I would just caution, it's not always those who shout the loudest who hold the majority opinion. But nonetheless, there has undoubtedly been an increase in anti-Israel feeling, in anti-Semitism. We have to confront it. I think sometimes we make two mistakes. And again, I tread here carefully because I'm talking about the response of a government, i.e. the Israeli government, which is not my government. There used to be a convention amongst British politicians, it really still exists, that you don't criticize the British government if you're in the opposition, like I am, when you're abroad. Fortunately, Israelis don't seem to be bound by that convention for their own government, and therefore perhaps I need not be either. I think the first mistake we make is we're rather like somebody sitting at a party, and if nobody wants to dance with them, they'll then dance with anybody who comes along. If the person who comes along is not somebody who you would have danced with anyway, I suggest you say no when they ask you to dance. Let me make it a bit sharper. When Minister Chickley invited Tommy Robinson, and I think I can speak about this because he's British, who is a convicted criminal, is a thug, and is somebody who is on the far right of British politics. When he's invited to Israel as an honoured guest, I don't think that improves Israel's standing in the UK, or frankly anywhere. I was embarrassed at the reception that was given to him. At the same time, as members of parliament, with whom I strongly disagree, were not allowed into Israel at all because they'd been invited by a left-wing organisation. I think that is a fundamental mistake in policy. The other point I'd make is that one of the big mistakes in politics, I would suggest, and I'm conscious that with Professor Rubinstein, we have somebody who has more experience of politics than the rest of us put together. But I think a common mistake is to say that my enemy's enemy is my friend. Sometimes that's true. Sometimes also my enemy's enemy is still my enemy. And we have to be clear-eyed about it. But they both come down to the same fundamental point, which is just because you're feeling lonely doesn't mean that you should hold the hand of anybody who comes along. What's most important, I would suggest, is for us to stick by the values which really make us who we are, which makes Israel what it is. Because without those values, we are really lost, and we won't have ultimately any friends at all.
As we are short of time, so I want on this topic just Professor Rubinstein, but please.
Well, Lord Wolfson was right that for many years, many of us did pursue the rule not criticizing the government abroad. I was very religious on that, but nowadays, not only because of the topic, but also because of the whole change in what's going on, the transparency and the technology and the networks, things change. In any case, the word I'd like to underline is responsibility. Responsibility, and there's another word, common sense. As far as responsibility, Israel has a responsibility towards itself and towards world Jewry. In fact, it's a constitutional principle in what's known as the nation basic law. I won't go into the debate on that, but there is an article, Article 6 speaks of the relationship with the Jewish people, and it says that the state will pursue assuring I'm translating, the peace of the Jewish people and its own citizens who are in trouble and sometimes in captivity for their Jewishness, for their citizenship, and the state will work in the diaspora to maintain the relationship and between the state and the Jewish people, and it will, and so on. When we do things, we have to think of the diaspora. The dialogue with the diaspora is vital. It is our interest, their interest, our combined interest, and if we don't do it, and sometimes we don't, it is a mistake. You need humility. You need humility in not feeling that you're omnipotent. We're not. And this is something which, by the way, it is also relevant to relations with our neighbors in a different way. The Arab culture, for instance, sees respect as a major part of its civility. Not that they always maintain it, but we should have this in mind. All I'm saying is look at the wide picture, and that's something which we should do. One word on anti-Semitism. In 1987, I was the cabinet secretary. It looks like ancient history, and I suggested to Prime Minister Shamir to start monitoring anti-Semitism. Mala Tabori was here, was working with me at the time. We did something without budget, without anything, having an interagency group that convened every few weeks and reported to the government on what's going on in this subject in written reports, which I wrote at the time, for a number of years. I later moved on to other things, so it wasn't my responsibility, but I mention it because I remember when I asked Shimon Peres, who was my personal friend, he was in my wedding, in fact, he was the foreign minister, to give us a representative to the forum. He said, Eli, he has this Polish accent, Eli, governments have to deal with the present and the future. Anti-Semitism is the past. Why deal with it? He later changed his mind, but what I'm trying to say is that some people are optimistic. He was optimistic on everything, on this we have to consult the Jewish diaspora on the fight against it. And at the time when we spoke to governments, they saw it as natural that Israel would speak to them about that. Not like in Russia in the earlier years when they said it's an internal matter. So when we think of legal, educational, political, diplomatic efforts on this, we have to take into consideration the Jewish diaspora and talk to them and encourage them, and they could encourage us. I'm saying that with a great conviction, and I'm not sure it happens. One word to finish on the former subject. Lord Wolfson mentioned, and I think, and of course, when we speak of, Pnina mentioned, when we speak of the Israeli court, we speak of a strategic asset of the state of Israel. And you don't abandon strategic assets. You can criticize them, you can try to say, want more balance, disappointment, that appointment, but not throwing the baby with the water. For years, I argued in international fora and in diplomatic work on, we'll take care of it because we have a strong legal system, Attorney General, courts, and so on. We have to maintain that too, and that also has to be remembered. Thank you very much.
In my speech, and I said 4 rules that are very simple that to define like anti-Semitism. So I said that, you know, no Jew in the diaspora is responsible for the activities or of the government or the state of Israel. So that's any Jew that is blamed and is not responsible of that. Now I want to discuss the other way around, and Professor Rubinstein started the responsibility of us towards the Jews in the diaspora. And I think Professor Porat, in your previous panel, you started with this, and if you can elaborate.
Yeah, I think it's a follow-up of what Justice Rubinstein has said. I do think that Israel has responsibility for the Jewish diaspora, and I think it goes both ways, right? And we've seen it after October 7 in a very clear way. You know, looking from my perspective as university president, that part of his job is also do fundraising, meeting people and trying to see whether they want to support Israeli academia. We have observed that there are many Jewish people that didn't have a real contact or emotional contact to Israel, actually changed their attitudes completely. We have some people that you know, many of them are very influential people in the United States that until October 7, as far as I know, has not donated almost anything to an Israeli cause, and suddenly changed their minds completely. Now, there is a question why. Of course, there is an obvious answer, which is a kind of an emotional one, that they feel that now, after, you know, once Israel under risk, etc., they feel more identified and their Jewish identity and so on. This is a possible explanation. But I've heard another explanation, which I think it's a little bit more sophisticated, but shows, actually responding to your question, Meir, which is that Jewish people realized, since Israel was under real existential risk, they realized how much it is important for them, even selfishly, that Israel would exist. You know, think for a moment, suppose Israel disappears, and regardless of what some Jewish people think about emotionally about Israel, they might be in a much different situation and not necessarily a better one. And this understanding that the state of Israel is a kind of an interest above an emotional one or religious one or Zionism, etc., that's, I think, something that we should all keep in mind. Of course, it goes also the other, I cannot imagine what would have happened with Israel if we didn't have the support of the Jewish diaspora all over the world. It's hard to imagine, or maybe easy to imagine. It would be very, very bad. So once we understand this interdependence between the State of Israel and the Jewish communities around the world, it also requires acts. So what we have to do. And I think there are many things that can be done. Looking, one thing, for example, I believe that today it seems more important than ever that within Jewish communities there would be people like professionals, people that are educated for that. It's a kind of a career job to combat anti-Semitism. And I think that Israeli universities could be a home, to provide them with the tools to do so. And this is something that I've tried to initiate a few years ago. I hope that eventually it would work. But this is one thing that we could do. Maybe last point, if I may, and it relates indeed to something that I've said before. When I meet with people, in Jewish communities, I always have this dilemma. I think also you, Elyakim, referred to it, whether to speak differently than the way I speak in my own country. I'll put it differently. So, for example, if I'm very critical on the government, some people would say, keep your critics inside, speak to your friends about it. But, for people outside of Israel, including the Jewish diaspora, they want to be identified with Israel. And once they see that Israeli society is torn apart, unfortunately, this is currently the situation, it wouldn't work for the good of Israel. I totally disagree, especially when the audience, like this audience, is a sophisticated one. I'm sure you understand that in democracies, this is the regular case. When you criticize the government not necessarily, sometimes it would converge also with criticizing Israel more generally, but it's not the same thing. I'm very critical on my government. Still, it comes out of love to my country. And that's what happens in democracies. And I believe that intelligent people should understand it. And once this is the situation, and we think that the Israeli government is doing something bad, like the legal reform, I think all the people sitting here, if I may say so, are very critical on the Israeli government with respect to the legal reform. Why not to say it loudly? Then I believe it would be sometimes a little bit more sophisticated for the audience, but at the end of the day, that would strengthen us, and that would also could sometimes even be a tool to say, yeah, the Israeli government was doing something, and you are very critical about it, but this is not necessarily the Israeli people. If you allow me, I don't know, maybe later, to say something about the human rights issue.
I want to give Pnina an opportunity to say what we should, because we see the effect of increasing anti-Semitism. Again, we had what Israel should do regarding that.
So first of all, I think it should be a consideration. I think when you look at what are the considerations that need to be made when making a certain decision, I think the Israeli government has a responsibility also to consider, it's not maybe number one, and of course we have first our existential threats and other interests, but it should be on the list and it should have a place, and that's already one thing that I'm not sure is done enough. I think I agree very much with Ariel that we need to strengthen the Jewish community in giving them tools to combat anti-Semitism. I think it's also important to give them tools in fighting anti-Zionism. And I think one thing there is the framing, this framing of the Zionist idea as a colonialist idea, which is going becoming so widespread. We have to counter it with a different idea, and I think the different idea that has to be stressed more is Zionism as the right of self-determination of the Jewish people. And I think when you push it to the world of self-determination, you are actually plugging into something that is part of the progressive way of speaking. And I think more has to be done there, not to be much more active on Israel's right to exist. And third thing, I think, and this is what not to do, I think by diverging, by making any kind of criticism against Israel and Israeli policy as anti-Semitism, by calling every critic an anti-Semite, we're weakening the ability to actually fight the real anti-Semites, and we are pushing those that are just having a genuine, legitimate, I would say, criticism. First of all, we are pushing them towards the edge of those that are really anti-Israel, but we are also putting the Jews in a difficult position, because if some of them share this criticism themselves or have questions about Israel's policy, and if saying that is considered anti-Semitism, so then we say, it's self-hating Jews. No, it is a legitimate criticism, and I think that we have to, as civil society maybe, also unpack this concept and make the differentiation not between supporting Israel no matter what and criticizing Israel, to supporting Israel and criticizing it legitimately, to non-legitimate criticism. And then it will also be easier to plug into the Jews that are more liberal and want to support Israel but still want to be able to criticize it.
One word with your permission. There was Justice Potter Stewart in the US Supreme Court once said, I cannot define pornography, but if I see it, I know that it is. With anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, there may be a difference, but many times we can smell right away what's behind the uttering of. And finally, what we need now in Israel is healing the rift, the public rift. It's easier said than done, but this is more the responsibility of the government than of the opposition. But there is a big rift in society. If you take a cab, you'll talk to the cab many times, you'll understand the rift. The rift is so, and one of the little pieces of evidence is fight on the inquiry committee. The inquiry committee is needed, and I'm not a friend of the President of the Supreme Court. We worked together for many years. He's a good justice. I have no doubt that if he has to appoint a committee, he will do a decent job of decent people, experts, and whoever is needed, and will do. But no, the government wouldn't let him do it, despite the fact that this is the law, because you can understand, you can guess why, but the need is, if they would take my advice, they wouldn't, but I would say, give him a point, move, the people will feel much more united. Thank you very much.
Just about pornography and anti-Semitism. In my presentation, the disproportionate criticism on Israel is anti-Semitism. It's not my view. This is now adopted by IRA, and we should be very sensible about it.
Can I just add one point? Because I agree very, very much with what, in particular, Ariel was saying. In fact, what everybody said on this topic. We're not taking questions on these panels, so perhaps I could just raise a point which I leave people to question and discuss over lunch. Never stand between Jews and lunch. I appreciate the difficulty of my position at the moment. We all agree that Israel is a vibrant democracy, and you can be against a government policy, you can be against the government, and still be incredibly patriotic. I don't think the current British government is all that great, but I hope that doesn't make me any less patriotic about the United Kingdom. A particular problem, though, arises for diaspora Jewish communities in this regard, because nobody thinks that my neighbours in my building in Tel Aviv are not Israeli patriots because they don't like the current government very much. It's very different, however, when you stand up in London or Paris or New York and criticize the Israeli government, because that is heard as criticizing the state of Israel. I don't have a very good answer to it. On the one hand, I don't like the Israel can do no wrong approach, because all countries make mistakes from time to time, and with the greatest of respect, Israel is no different. Everybody makes mistakes. I also don't like the people who, where their Jewishness, it seems only to attack Israel or to attack the Jewish people, the people who Howard Jacobson called the as a Jews, because their letters to the paper always start as a Jew, and you just know what's going to come after that. It's always critical. So I struggle with this issue, and perhaps some people here might struggle with it over lunch as well.
Professor Porat, we have after because we want. Sure. No, it's not ignored, Professor Porat. No, it's not ignored. But we can further discuss it. Thank you very much. It was interesting panel, and now I think there is the lunch now. Yeah. Okay. Bon appétit.